We built up this apparatus of the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve bit by bit, looking at the aggregate demand separately, the long-run aggregate supply separately, the short-run aggregate supply separately. Now let's put them all together and look at macroeconomic fluctuations using this setup. Now, not surprisingly, as an economist, when I've got these three curves together, we want to look at where they all come together in order to start. So we've got some initial price level and some initial level of real GDP, where we've got, say, full employment. So we're at the level of output associated with full use of resources. And we're going to do an analysis of a change in one of the underlying factors and see how that works its way through this setup. Now, in order to do that, a couple of things to keep in mind. We talked about aspects that would shift the aggregate demand curve, a change in consumption, say consumer sentiment, business sentiment through investment, government spending, exports minus imports, the net exports, going to not focus on that as much. Short-run aggregate supply will be affected by changes in the labor force, changes in technology, resource availability or costs, and also price expectations. Now here's a menu of how, or checklist, if you will, of how to do this kind of analysis. It's very useful to follow the same procedures every single time. Have this checklist next to you as you do the analysis and do it this way every time. You'll get on the road to the right answer. First, we look at whatever has the specific scenario that we're trying to analyze, and what is typically going to be a shift of one of these curves. It's like, well, which curve is moving? Okay, that's the first thing. Have the initial effect. Which direction does it shift? That curve that's affected in the first step. Look at the effects in the short run using the aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply curve, and then look at the effects over the long haul. If you follow this procedure, you should be in good shape. So let's imagine we've got increase in consumer pessimism. They're freaked out by something. It could be a housing crisis, it could be worries about political stability, changing whatever. Something has made consumers nervous. Now, we ask, well, where does consumption fit into this story? What curve is initially affected? Well, you look over here, it affects consumption. It affects aggregate demand. Now you ask, well, which direction does the aggregate demand curve shift if there's less spending by consumers? At any given level of the prices, there'll be less demand. A shift in aggregate demand to the left. Okay, so we've got this initial effect, aggregate demand shifting to the left. Clearly, if you shift it to the right, you're going to go off the wrong direction. Now you ask, what is the effect in the short run? For this, we're going to look at the new aggregate demand curve that's shifted and the short run aggregate supply curve. at a point like B. So what you see here is that the change in the demand for goods is going to reduce demand, but it's also going to change the short-run aggregate supply. Now again, we can go back and look at those three stories that we told about short-run aggregate supply: sticky wages, sticky prices, misperceptions. And let's just use the sticky wages as part of the story. The others are okay, but let's just do the wages. What you have is a drop in the demand for goods. Firms might like to reduce the wages that they pay because they're not selling as much. They can't do that because they're contracts or whatever. They can't lay off workers. They can't reduce the wages. What they do is they cut back on output, probably cut back on their workforce, the people that they've employed. You're going to have a decrease in the output associated with that drop in demand. This is essentially a recession. A drop in the amount of output away from the full employment level in the short run. Now, let's imagine that there's no government intervention. Okay, we let firms and consumers adjust to this without any kind of government action. Well, firms with this short-run aggregate supply curve have made their decisions based on what they perceive prices will be. Okay, they made that, they're making these initial decisions, and the prices are falling compared to what they thought they were going to be. Well, as the prices fall, they start to adjust their decisions. We then look at this part of the analysis. You'll have a shift in today's short-run aggregate supply curve because prices are lower than people expected. You'll have a new short-run aggregate supply curve with lower prices and back to the full employment level of output. Now, this transition from A to B to C takes some time. You're going to have the possibility that there'll be significant unemployment for some time until people are able to adjust to the new lower level of demand. As those prices go down, consumers start to buy again, back to full employment level of output without any government intervention. That results in lower prices, full employment output, but it may take a while. And there's a lot of potential economic suffering in the meantime. Prices are dropping, and there may be pressure on the government to do something. So let's just imagine that instead of having no government intervention, that we had instead an increase in government spending if you will, at point B. The government says, we can't wait. It's like, we've got people unemployed, we got to do something now. We're not going to wait for this adjustment process to occur. Well, that, from point B, the increase in aggregate demand through increase in government spending shifts the aggregate demand curve back. So the sort of Keynesian story about government intervention will be that you are essentially replacing the drop in consumer demand because of the increased pessimism with government spending to offset that recessionary pressures. So this is similar to what happened in 2009, 2010. There was an increase in consumer pessimism, drop in consumer demand because of the housing crisis. Stimulus comes in, increase in government spending, and the idea was to get you back up to point A. Now, one thing about considering the situation with no government intervention and an increase in government spending. With the increase in government spending, you're back up at point A with higher prices than would be the case if you let the economy adjust. So one of the stories that more conservative economists would say is that, yeah, you might be able to prop up demand, but prices will be higher than they might otherwise be. A more liberal economist would say, I don't care about prices, I care about people who are suffering out of work. That's the kind of fundamental trade-off of how quickly you think the government will, or the economy can right itself, adjust to the new situation, take care of the unemployment on its own, and how much do you think the government should step in and make efforts to change that outcome? Both have downsides. If you wait, you have people unemployed. If you intervene quickly, you have higher prices than you might otherwise have. And that's really the debate about a lot of macroeconomic policies, is how you deal with these changes. Now, one of the things that will be important in an international course is that we're going to see that what can effectively change aggregate demand can be influenced by balance of payments effects, exchange rate effects. But in this closed economy, this would be the story of how government action could affect economic responses to a recession.